So thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. I'm going to talk about the local Mikrorajona situation, but I'll give a little bit of background first of all. I'm leading a program together with Charles Passard called Urbanism and Societal Change. It's based at the Royal Academy in Copenhagen. For some reason my clicker is not working. It's off. Okay, now it's working. So we have been working on various issues, and the team that we've been working on recently dealing with the situation here is involving Greta and Carlos, who I teach with together on this group, but also the great help of Jorge, who spoke earlier, who we've been cooperating with, and also Jon Eskimosa and Michelle DeMarco, who in a way have been working already in Riga and have in a way allowed us to enter into a lot of different networks here, which has been fantastic. So we spent actually a year looking into the kind of modernist, let's say, legacy of the kind of machine city logics of prefabricated concrete construction. First of all, we've been spending half a year together with the students in the master's program, who two or three of them are going to talk about some of these projects later. We've been looking, first of all, in a Danish context at this idea of the machine city on the left-hand side, which represents a kind of counterpoint to the kind of garden city notion. A notion in terms of the machine city in a Danish context that started off with the idea of the kind of workers' paradise, which has in recent years been associated in the press and in the media with many kind of social problems, and also connected to the idea of spatial segregation in society, the notion that these kind of modernist complexes represent the emblems for spatial fragmentation and social fragmentation in Danish society. Where we see, for example, here in this kind of representation of income, an almost perfect mapping between the idea of the machine city, which we see here, here at Tingbjerg, for example, and the garden city that we see here, mapping almost perfectly between the notion or representation of social problems that the students tried to, let's say, question and critique the idea that this particular typology has been associated with all kinds of, let's say, social ills, to actually look at exploring different spatial possibilities, both in restructuring between the spaces of the interior, between public and private space, as well as semi-public and semi. Also exploring possibilities for open space between these areas. Also looking at questions such as the stigmatization of these neighborhoods in relation to larger concepts of infrastructure in the city. In this case, a project that was questioning and looking at the idea of rerouting light rail infrastructure through these projects to try to actually change and reframe their position in the city and in larger society. So we were very interested not only in looking at these typologies in a Danish context, but also in a different context, in this case, in the context of the larger Mikrorajona project that is obviously interesting in different ways, both in a kind of generic sense, where we see generic conditions related to, for example, the sheer notion of a vast scale of production of prefabricated concrete construction that, for example, represents a kind of extraordinary and vast production of housing, which we not only see in locations such as St. Petersburg, but also in entirely different contexts such as Kabul, that we see here, which is extraordinary both for its scale and also its rationalization in the way that the kind of structuring and relationship at an urban scale as well as an architectural scale sets up all different kinds of relationships and rules that are, let's say, highly rationalized and organized. We see also in that kind of scale, from an architectural standpoint and an urban standpoint, many possibilities and potentials. One of these is related to some work we've been doing with an American theorist who is very interested less in the notion of the architect producing the single masterwork, the kind of masterwork of the single museum, for example, or the single private house, but rather, let's say, the possibility of looking at these large production systems of architecture and urbanism and seeing the possibility in them to hack into them and actually impose possible change through understanding those larger systems. We're also interested in, and I'm just going to run through some of these kind of issues, and then I'll show some of these projects, and I'd be very interested to talk about them. The idea, obviously, around the kind of lifespan of these buildings, the notion of some kind of 50-year time frame for each system, which obviously doesn't translate into a kind of structural collapse of these buildings, but actually represents questions of different kinds of obsolescence. In different terms of systems, but also questions of social obsolescence or also functional obsolescence. Also interesting for us was the difference between the conditions that we see in Denmark to what we see here is through the sheer scale, in the sense that this represents the majority of housing in this context. We simply don't see the same stigma attached to these housing complexes. It's very much the space of the everyday, which doesn't represent the same, let's say, social stigma. We see also a kind of vast, and this has been discussed already, potential of the kind of communal space in these settings. The idea here in the very first Mikrorajona exhibition, which represents Khrushchev's dream of a kind of highly intense or intensified public space between these buildings, we see quite different, let's say, realizations of a kind of public space framing or common ground, which obviously is also under pressure from different interests. And then what we obviously did to try to understand the context better is also to come to Riga, but also travel around Latvia and also around Estonia, where we tried with the students also to meet with different people. We were very lucky actually to meet with a number of experts, for example, Jonas from the Urban Institute. We were very lucky to have presentations from experts from the Technical University, Alexander's, of course, from the municipality, and so forth. So in a way, we felt honored that we were able to somehow try to understand some of the different dynamics taking place here, very much as humble outsiders, but with the intention, let's say, of trying to understand the realities that are taking place here. Obviously, the notion around discussions of depopulation dynamics, which are obviously not even. These dynamics, of course, have quite differentiated characteristics, where we see, for example, a relationship between depopulation and the kind of conditions of sprawl that you're all familiar with. These questions that have already been discussed or raised from Jorge earlier around the complexity of the ownership conditions, where we see this kind of extraordinary fragmentation of land ownership and obviously challenges in coordination of development. We see also in the kind of historical, cultural context, questions or what we could even call suspicion over, let's say, any discussion of collective action or collective organization. We see also the issues around complex ethnic and linguistic geographies, pressures that we see in development around issues like parking, as well as very much some notion of transformed desires around what residents actually want in terms of how they expect to live, that are quite different, obviously, from the expectations and understandings of the interior life of apartments designed during this period that we see playing out with quite limited choices of materiality and so forth. Where we see, since the, let's say, over the last 20 years, an extraordinary blossoming of individual expression, of transformation and understanding the potential of the individual playing out through the interior of the apartment. So as I mentioned, I'm going to show 3 to 4 projects. These projects are also shown at the town hall in the exhibition that was open yesterday. So I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I have 11 minutes left. I'm going to show them also in the sense that I think that they represent not, let's say, completed solutions, but let's understand them, let's say, as provocations and possible visions that might suggest some, let's say, humble possibilities around discussing what could be done in these areas. So the first project I talk about very briefly, it comes from Robert, Jakob and Carolina, which deals very much with this kind of fragmentation and diversity around the radical different nature of each of these parcels. What the project tries to do, and I think the contribution of the project, is to attempt to come up with some system of classifying and understanding different characteristics that might allow a kind of planning logic to start to play out based on different, let's say, commonalities between these fragmented realities. where they tried to explore how this might translate into some kind of, let's say, framework for discussing how these different contexts could play out. What they were interested in doing is trying to see the different possible roles between the municipality, let's say landowners and residents, and the role also that the architect could play in proposing different outcomes where, for example, if the municipality were to ban or control surface parking, that this might, let's say, open up another opportunity for placing other, let's say, realities on the ground surface. The proposal, and we discussed this in many ways, that the feeling was that it was somehow outscaled for the site in Pertiums, but the idea that by placing, if I just go back, by placing parking underground, the possibility would actually be to invest in the ground surfaces together with understanding the different, let's say, constraints and requirements around different qualities and characteristics such as climate, to actually start to develop logics for a kind of development that could actually, let's say, live with and actually flourish within this kind of fragmentation logic. The idea that through understanding the different, let's say, possibilities and parameters of these different plot types, one would be able to see different, let's say, possible contributions to development in these areas. I keep moving quickly through these projects. The next one is coming from Asal, Daniel, and Natasha, which they call typological correction, which in their sense reacts to several different kind of conditions. One of these conditions is the question around contemporary desires for housing quality in terms of square meters, but also around different migration patterns which place different microrayons under different levels of pressure. From the idea of microrayons that are very desirable and are not having very large vacancy rates, and other microrayons that are actually fairly empty. What they also look at is how different possibilities could emerge from understanding various shortcomings in the housing itself. What they talk about in the interviews with many residents is, for example, limitation of storage. They talk about also the inflexibility of spatial subdivision, as well as obviously the conditioning question around climate, but also energy consumption in these areas. What they did was an extensive study into a number of different housing examples where they tried to be inspired to rethink potential layouts and organizations of housing interiors, where they tried to explore through these different themes between storage and also, for example, air conditioning situations, how different organizations could be possible. And through that developed a series of tools that you see on the top right-hand corner. What they were interested in was, let's say, distinguishing between these different conditions, between the declining microrayon, the stable microrayon, and the desirable microrayon, where, for example, the declining microrayon they saw as a kind of site of great potential for expanding square meters per unit, where they described a kind of horizontal or vertical colonization, where you see, for example, here, the expansion of units into adjacent units. They were also looking at the standardization of different, let's say, structural elements that could be placed in different contexts, excuse me, to allow for reorganizations of interiors. Which they show here. The stable microrayon they saw also as a possibility, let's say, of exploring both the potential for insulation on the roof that could supply also common space, that could here allow for also energy production. And the last example, which was perhaps the most detailed, was in situations, for example, in a Riga, where you see, or not in a Riga, but Riga itself, where you see large microrayon areas that are still attractive and well tenanted. The possibility to look at, let's say, different expansion strategies. So here they were looking at combining this roof insulation logic together with a hanging system that would allow for different types of expansion. What they saw as kind of plug-in devices that would allow residents to actually themselves buy into these catalogs, where they could actually transform their square meters, for example, through standard bathroom expansions or kitchen expansions that would be built into this kind of logic. So it was very much, let's say, looking at the multiplication logic here of applying aspects that could be, let's say, applied on the exteriors of these desirable contexts. The third project, which deals with various scales, including a very large scale, which was very much inspired by, let's say, what was perceived as a large absence of what was perceived by many of the students as a kind of extraordinary landscape quality in a Latvian context, which is the Latvian forest. They delved into the role of the forest in the kind of Latvian popular culture, as well as literature and painting and so forth, as well as, let's say, explored forest spaces, and became increasingly interested, let's say, of the use of forest as a technique that might react and in some way become a planning device or planning instrument in relation, in this case, to the idea of expansion and sprawl in the city. This worked at a number of different scales, which you can see in the next video here, where what they're trying to do is, let's say, exploring the role of forest in some way as a kind of infrastructural space that could be used as a kind of dynamic space for reacting to depopulation, reacting to emptiness, but also becoming, let's say, a kind of logic of spatial coherency and landscape coherency within the city, not only in the larger areas, but could become a device. Here you see on the bottom different possibilities around population increase or decline. That becomes, let's say, a way of thinking of this as a kind of reactive planning system. There was thinking about how this would react over time, where you see different levels of forestry and how this would transform over time, as well as sort of different ideas that would work also at other scales. The idea of the kind of largely unused industrial areas around the microrajons, of finding new possibilities of how these might relate. For example, here in the work of Alexander, of trying to, let's say, find new forms of resource circuits, also around wood in this case. They were looking also at how forestry could become a very strong landscape quality in defining the public space between various microrayon buildings, which we see here through the specification of different forest types, as well as different kind of landscaping gestures that would start to better define the public spaces that you see here and try to make them more intimate, that we see in an image here. As well as looking at how this could become a way of interacting in the inner city also, that we see here. For example, if we just go back, in the idea of actually reorganizing street profiles and reorganizing the role of landscape within the street, particularly where we see large numbers of empty buildings. That's playing out also in this context. They also, so we see this kind of idea of what they call threads through the city that would represent this kind of landscape, coherent landscapes that would move through the spaces. They also proposed how this would become a tool or instrument, in this case in the suburban areas or peri-urban areas around Riga, where one would see a kind of shift from a predominant logic around large parking spaces and an open landscape into much more intensified landscape combining forest elements. So a kind of shift from this logic toward this kind of logic as a kind of atmosphere or quality. So just to kind of conclude, what we discovered, and not what we discovered, but let's say what we discussed intensively through this is, let's say, this notion that this kind of scale of the challenges around obsolescence suggests the sheer necessity for some form of coordinated or facilitated response. In this context, let's say, of the scale of this issue, when one discusses the percentage of housing stock involved in microrajons, the kind of urgency of these issues, that one almost doesn't see the possibility of moving forward without some form of strong leadership, let's say, in the form of facilitation, more than, let's say, in the form of pure top-down decision-making. And this was, let's say, something that was discussed in the notion not only around energy efficiency discussions, but also, let's say, if we discuss in the context of the typological correction project, also the sheer possibility of systems like this and their usage when one looks at the scale of this issue. The last kind of issue, which leads into a very short presentation of the last project, is the notion of not only bottom-up, but also the necessity, together with bottom-up, of developing top-down. And obviously that's what's being discussed today, which I'm also very interested in that discussion and very happy that that discussion is taking place here today. which relates, I'll just very briefly wrap up with this last project, which is called Panel Housing Plus, which starts with the presentation of the authors Alice and Peter on the right, in a kind of dialogue with Khrushchev's original manifesto for the Mikrorajona, with the idea around the necessity of an urgent housing shortage, which requires a uniform, rationalized, and machine-led response. Their kind of manifesto is in many ways arguing for the use of multiplication, but in this case, dedicated not towards standardization, but towards embracing this reality of this kind of extraordinary, let's say, diversity, both on the interior and, as we see, the emerging exteriors, through a new form of, let's say, catalog, a new form of system that, from their perspective, becomes a kind of facilitation device that would offer many possibilities within the logic of the catalog. So they studied these different forms of catalogs, understood between prescriptive and unprescriptive, between kind of top-down and bottom-up facilitating, and developed, let's say, ideas around, and I don't really have time to go into it because my time is up and the screen is flashing red, but I'll just quickly flash through some slides which you can see more in the exhibition and the videos that they present around these ideas, where one sees, let's say, how they see the role of the municipality playing out, how they see the responsibility of tenants and landowners, and how they see the possibility also to exploit what appears, if I just go back, is a very, let's say, small representation of public institutions and infrastructure such as libraries or clinics in the Mikrorajona areas. So the idea that this would be an area to, or a way to even out the possibility of access to these kinds of public goods in the Mikrorajona areas which are lacking. So in this case, the presentation of different ways of structuring relationships that might start to become a way of, together between different stakeholders, developing ideas for example, the unused space between buildings that we see here through the use of wood rather than concrete, and the multiplication potential of small elements such as the bubble window that they developed in the end walls through different, let's say, relationships between funders, stakeholders, state actors, and so forth. So I'll finish there. Thank you.